Google is shutting off consumer Gemini CLI request serving on June 18, 2026. So if Gemini CLI is part of your daily workflow, this is not a cute product rename. This is a migration deadline with a few very boring ways to break your setup. This video is about what Google is actually changing, who needs to care right now, what the migration docs quietly say, and the practical checklist I would use before trusting Antigravity CLI with real work. My take is simple: migrate early, but do not migrate blindly. On May 19, 2026, Google said Gemini CLI had proved the terminal could work for agentic tasks, but that user workflows had outgrown the old shape of the product. The official line is that builders now want multiple agents, asynchronous workflows, and one shared backend with the rest of the tool stack. So Google is consolidating around Antigravity, with Antigravity CLI as the terminal surface and Antigravity 2.0 as the desktop surface. That part matters, because this is not just a faster binary. It is Google telling you the CLI is now supposed to live inside one bigger agent system. Here is the date that matters.
Google says that on June 18, 2026, Gemini CLI and the Gemini Code Assist IDE extensions stop serving requests for Google AI Pro and Ultra users, plus the free individual tier. Enterprise is different. Google says Standard, Enterprise, GitHub through Google Cloud, and paid API key-based access remain supported separately. So the first practical takeaway is, if you are a consumer or individual tier Gemini CLI user, this is a real deadline. If you are an enterprise user, do not assume the same migration pressure applies. Google makes three big promises here. First, Antigravity CLI is built in Go and should feel faster. Second, it supports asynchronous and multi-agent workflows in the background. Third, and most importantly, it shares the same agent harness as Antigravity 2.0, so future improvements land across both surfaces. That third point is the real platform move. Google is effectively saying, stop thinking of the CLI as a separate little terminal toy. It is now one surface on top of a shared agent runtime. Which is strategically sensible. Also slightly ominous in the way every shared control plane becomes interesting right before it becomes your problem. Now the catch. Google's own migration guide says Antigravity CLI supports the majority of Gemini CLI workflow features, but not 100% feature parity. That sentence should control your entire attitude, because a lot of migration pain lives inside words like majority, most, and should. The good news is that Google documents the main migration path pretty clearly. Plugins can be imported with AG plugin import Gemini. The less fun news is that some things move, some things rename, and some things do not map one-to-one. Here are the four boring places I would check first. Number 1, workspace skills. The migration docs say global skills are shared, but workspace local skills may need to move from .gemini/skills into .agents/skills. Number 2, MCP config. Gemini CLI kept MCP server definitions in line in settings.json. Antigravity CLI uses a separate mcp_config.json file. Number 3, remote MCP field names. Google specifically says Antigravity CLI uses server URL instead of URL for remote MCP servers. That is exactly the kind of tiny config change that wastes an hour and makes you question your life choices. Number 4, auth flow. The Getting Started docs say local auth can open a browser, while SSH sessions may require copying a URL and pasting an authorization code back into the terminal. So if your old workflow assumed a smoother auth pattern, test it on the machine you actually use. Most visible anti-gravity coverage right now looks like one of two things. Either it is a beginner tutorial, like build your first app with AI, or it is broad launch coverage about agentic coding. What seems thinner is migration discipline. What breaks, what moves, what stays the same, and which one real task you should test before June 18th. That is why I think this story is worth a video. The missing value is not hype, it is workflow hygiene. Now let me separate official claims from anecdotal user reports. Officially, Google says the important workflow features are there. Anecdotally, visible community posts show 3 recurring frustrations. People confused about what Antigravity CLI actually replaces, people unhappy with limits or parity gaps, and people reporting friction around plugins, MCP behavior, or older hardware compatibility. That does not prove a platform-wide failure, but it does prove something more useful for builders. This migration deserves a real test, not a vibes-based assumption that shared harness equals smooth upgrade. So here is the playbook I would use. Install Antigravity CLI before the deadline, not on the deadline. Run the plugin import once and note what converts versus what gets skipped. Check whether your project has workspace local skills sitting in .gemini/skills. If yes, move them where the new CLI expects them. Audit MCP config next. Separate the file if needed. Rename URL to server URL for remote servers where required. Then do one real task, not a toy prompt, a real task you already trust Gemini CLI with. If that task depends on skills, hooks, MCP, auth, or long-running agent behavior, even better. That is the stress test you actually care about.
And if you hit something weird, decide whether Antigravity CLI is ready for your daily driver workflow now, or whether it is only ready for a second track experiment. This migration is also a useful reminder about the whole agent tools market. The flashy headline is always model capability. The painful truth is usually config shape, tool wiring, permission flow, runtime behavior, and whether your existing workflow survives the next product consolidation. In other words, the boring layer still decides who ships. So yes, migrate, but migrate like an engineer, not like a keynote attendee. The real anti-gravity test is not whether the logo changed or the terminal looks cooler. It is whether your actual workflow still works on June 18th.